All right, we're on Genesis 8. So uh, we are in the midst of the flood, right? And God remembers Noah. And sorry, you can see sort of right here caused a wind to pass over the earth. That wind is a ruach, which is the same word for spirit or breath. So just like day one of the creation, you've got sort of the ruach, the wind, the spirit, God over the fluttering over the waters, and day two says right here the water, the sources of the watery depths and the floodgates of the sky were closed. So you remember in the creation account they separated the waters underneath from the waters above. They put the rakia, the shield. To keep the waters above there. And when the flood came, basically the waters came back up from underneath and they opened the windows in the rakia. So to undo creation. And now you can see basically what we're doing is redoing creation. So we closed up the windows, the watery depths receded, and you had land just like day two or day three. You land, the ark comes to rest. So the land is being separated from the water. Um, and as you sort of keep going through this, the birds come out first that are there. So that's sort of the day five thing. And then by the time there you go, the, right, the 7 up to verse 14. There you go. Yeah. And the Lord's promise. That is when everybody starts to get out. So that is day six, right? That's when you're actually able to get out of the boat. All the animals come back on, and they all populate the land, right? So we're back to where creation was, and Noah built an altar to the Lord, made some offerings, and you have a very sort of personalized account from God, where he smells the aroma, is pleased, and he says, the wording there is actually, he says, in his heart. Is the wording. He says in his heart that he will never again curse the ground because of human beings, even though we deserve it. And he says that specifically, right? So he says, when he said to himself, he says in his heart, I will never again curse the ground, even though the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth onward. So he understands that we are going to try to decide good and evil for ourselves over and over again instead of taking his guidance. And yet, he will still make these promises to us, which leads directly into the first official mention of a covenant of God with man. So, if you know anything about me, or if you came to our theology before, so I would, and probably I would say the majority, but not by too much, but majority of theologians are sort of covenant theologians, which would say the first covenant was actually with Adam. They're not use the words covenant, but basically all the pieces are there. There's an agreement with God and Adam, and it's got restrictions on it, and it's got a formal agreement, and Adam breaks that covenant, right? But that covenant basically just unfolds through Noah, through Moses, through David, and eventually to the new covenant. But basically, what God is doing is revealing that covenant with the full understanding that the new covenant is the end goal. That's where we're headed. And he just sort of reveals piece of it or expands and adds to it until we get to the new covenant with Jesus. So there is another camp which would usually call dispensationalists. That's still obviously there's covenants here. Some of those, most of them would even still argue there's a covenant with Adam. But some of those would argue against that piece. But they sort of see the covenants as a little bit more standalone than I would. But it's sort of beside the point. This is the first full agreement that God has laid out here and says, I'm going to give you a sign for this covenant. And that sign is the rainbow. So there are signs for other covenants. So Moses goes up and has a covenant with God and comes down with the Ten Commandments. Abraham has a covenant and the sign is circumcision comes out of that. So these covenants and signs are very important throughout the Bible. This one is probably not mentioned as much. It's important, depending on your view of natural law. Some people like the covenant with Noah and talk about it a lot. Most of the time, the covenant with Abraham is sort of the biggie, but also Moses, David, and obviously the biggie is the new covenant as it's going through. So those covenants are important, but you see here as well that in 9, he comes right out and he says, God bless Noah and his sons. And he says, again, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. It does add now that the fear, so I don't know if you can see me, but I'm in the way. The fear and terror of you will be in every living creature on the earth. So that's new. That's added on, right? So that's sort of saying before the fall, potentially that could have been after the fall, and we don't really know how that shakes out. And maybe it's only mentioned here, but we do know that before the fall, Adam was walking with the animals, and it seemed to be an awful lot more peaceful. Whereas now he's sort of saying, hey, by the way, there's some fear or terror going in there, but it says specifically they are placed under your authority, right? So he's basically just re-upping the directions that he gave to Adam. So we had talked before about the creation mandate or kingdom mandate or cultural mandate, whatever you want to call it, to Adam to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, to sort of bring order on behalf of God according to his decisions of right and wrong. And this is just basically re-emphasized here. So if you sort of thought that was just an Adam thing, clearly it's not, because it's almost word for word re-emphasized right here. And it says in verse 7 as well, be fruitful, multiply, spread out over the earth, and multiply on it. So that's going to be important in just a little bit when we get to the Tower of Babel. You'll see that, because they don't listen and they don't want to spread out over the earth. So they continue that on, and then basically what you do is you move into Noah's family. So the first story, very wonderful, quick story. Noah makes a vineyard, gets drunk, gets seen while he's naked, and curses his son. And like so many of these stories that are in the Bible, you're just sort of like, wow, one, that's a bit of a strange story. And two, that seems like quite an overreaction. But what you have to understand when you're reading the Bible, and I do this as much as anybody, like this, if he planted a vineyard and then it talks about some drink, that had to be a number of years, right? Because you don't just plant a vineyard and I'm making wine, right? It takes a while to get grapes. So you sort of, this is not a, 2 days later, he's drunk and he's angry and whatever, right? This is a long process. And in all likelihood, as we sort of go through and you see Ham's descendants and you read about the rest of the story, Ham is not the chosen line. So as you saw all the way back from Cain and Abel, right, we followed Cain's line down and they were rebelling against God's authority. This story is continuing right here. Ham is continually rebelling against God's authority. So in all likelihood, this is sort of a straw that broke the camel's back. And yes, this is what gets put into the book. But in all likelihood, Noah has seen this character for years. He knows exactly what's going on with Ham and knows how this is working, right? So, but the story is basically he gets drunk, Ham sees him, and goes and tells his brothers. So there are some that point to the wording where it says he saw his nakedness and he uncovered himself. Some people think that has some level of perversion involved or sexual activity. Most scholars don't think that. Some do and think that that's why he's so angry or whatever. Most would just say that basically it's just a sign that rather than trying to protect his father, that rather than trying to respect him and keep him from shame, Ham instead goes and spreads his shame to others. And he goes and gets other people and says, hey, look at this, the guy's drunk and naked. And blah, blah. So that is why he's angry. Now, should he have been drunk and naked? Obviously not. But I think what they're saying is Ham is the type of son that continuously is rebelling against his father rather than trying to lift his father up or protect his father or respect his father. So instead, Shem and Japheth, Shem is going to be, most people believe, the firstborn. He's the one that will follow as the chosen branch as we continue on through to Abraham. And you'll see that here is the curse here. Canaan will be cursed, and that is Ham's land. And he said, "Blessed will be the God of blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be Shem's slave. Let God extend Japheth. Let Japheth dwell in the tents of Shem." Right. So sort of Shem is going to be the chosen branch, but bless Japheth as well. And you're going to see the branch of Ham is a little bit more ropey at times, right? So the next thing that happens is you get the Table of Nations. And if you watched my Ezra video, you'll see sometimes the authors aren't quite as worried about chronological order, and they put things in the order for them that makes sense topically. So what's going on is they're talking about Noah's descendants. So they put the Table of Nations, right? And then what's going to happen is when we get to chapter 11, that's not today, but when we get to chapter 11, it's the Tower of Babylon and spreading people out. It's pretty clear to me and to most sort of people that study the Bible that the Tower of Babylon happens before the Table of Nations is sort of happening. But the way it's written is like, here's the descendants and here's all the nations that they found. They start. And then in chapter 11, it says, here's where God actually disperses them and gives them their own language. And they go off and they make those Table of Nations, right? So in theory, you could say chronologically, it would make more sense to do this Tower of Babylon first and tell that story. But what they're doing is they're talking about the genealogy of Noah. So they're saying, hey, this is where all these descendants went, and they went and formed these nations. And then it actually goes back and tells the story of what dispersed all those people. So don't get confused by that as we go through. So the Table of Nations is basically there are 70 descendants, or 70, some people say 70 nations as it's going out, and it tells where they go. So Japheth's sons are first, and most of those go to sort of Mediterranean over to Asia area. And then Ham's sons are next right here. And Ham's sons generally are more Africa, Arabia, the bottom part of where Saudi Arabia is, that sort of area, right? And Cush, which is in Africa, was one of the first sons mentioned. And then this is the sort of only little extra you kind of get in there, which is Cush fathered Nimrod, who began to be powerful in the land. He was a powerful hunter in the sight of the Lord. So that wording is a little bit unique, and some people think that should be a hunter of men, basically. So not just a powerful hunter of animals, but also of men. But either way, he is a powerful sort of warlord. And that's why it's said, like Nimrod, a powerful hunter in the sight of the Lord, right? And his kingdom started with Babylon, which is actually a little bit north. So he came out of Cush, went north, but interestingly, he started Babylon and Nineveh, which are two of the Babylon is basically the archetype of sort of the fallenness of man when they get together and form nations and groups. So Babylon is sort of meant to be all the way through to Revelations, this sign of curse, right? And it started by, surprisingly enough, Ham's line, and specifically Nimrod, who also started Nineveh. If you know the story of Jonah, Nineveh is sort of an archenemy of God's chosen people at that time, which is why Jonah was so upset. He's like, "Are you kidding me? You're trying to send me to Nineveh?" Right? So you already see these lines being drawn as it's coming together. And then it finishes with Shem's sons here at the end. And basically, the interesting thing is down here, it says right here. I can't even get these names, but Arpachshad fathered Shelah, and Shelah fathered Eber. So interesting, because you're going to see in just a little bit, it's going to continue on this line, Eber, after the Tower of Babylon, the next chapter, and it's going to go into Abraham. So this is the line that goes down to Abraham. And Eber is expected to be where the name Hebrew comes from. So Hebrew is basically sons of Eber, is sort of where they're coming up with that name. as it goes on. So this is the Abraham line, right? And it tells you that these are all their nations. These are all the clans of Noah's sons in their nations. The nations on earth spread out from these after the flood, right? So basically, that's why they call this the Table of Nations. You've got these 70 descendants forming nations. And it sort of explains the world at that time in terms of what nations are there and everything else. So that is the end of chapter 10. What you'll see in the next chapter, which we'll go over then, is how you ended up spreading out and creating that. So, and we'll mention some other, maybe the Deuteronomy worldview, some of that stuff. So, but that's it for Genesis. So I hope you enjoyed.